Hey everyone, this is Glen Greenwald. Welcome to a new edition of System Update with Glen Greenwald here on Rumble. I wanted to make a video in order to discuss the unfolding events in Afghanistan and specifically to talk about an article that I wrote earlier this morning on my Substack page. And for those of you who don't know, Substack is a free speech platform where I do my written journalism, and you can go and find my reporting there at greenwald.substack.com. And the headline of my article was, the U.S. government lied for 2 decades about Afghanistan. And for me, this is really central to everything that's happening, because obviously any decent person is horrified by what we're all seeing in Afghanistan, desperate people trying unsuccessfully to get out, fleeing the savagery and violence of the Taliban. And the instinct is to say, well, the US government should do something about that. But what I think is the place that instinct comes from is one of shock. We were never prepared to expect that the Taliban would just simply overrun the country within days, or in some cases even hours, after the US withdrawal. And we should have been prepared for that, because it was known for 20 years that there was no real Afghan military or Afghan police, no such thing as the vaunted Afghan national security forces that our political and military leaders kept assuring us were being successfully built and fortified and close to defending the country. And so because we've heard that for 20 years, we expected that to be at least somewhat true, that there would be some resistance to the Taliban after the US spent billions upon billions upon billions of dollars, lost thousands of lives, fought for the longest war in U.S. history, that there'd be something to show for it. And yet it was like it didn't even exist, that Afghan military. The Taliban just waltzed right back into Kabul and into the presidential palace in a way that completely contradicted everything we've been told for 20 years. And I think therein lies the shock of all these events. So I think it's worth reviewing the amazing video and other documentary evidence showing how consistently and repeatedly and deliberately our political and military leaders lied to us about what was taking place in Afghanistan, and the conclusive evidence that shows that they weren't just in error for good faith reasons. They just got it wrong while sincerely trying to tell us what was true. They knew they were lying all along, and there's so much evidence. Here, for example, is the first time a president gave us that message, which was basically weeks after the war began. It was George W. Bush, and he was speaking to the country in December of 2001. Here's what he said.
And our allies and the brave fighters of Afghanistan, the Taliban regime is coming to an end.
The Taliban regime is coming to an end. It was a celebratory speech applauded by many people in December of 2021, just about 20 years ago. And then just a few months later, in April of 2002, so 4 months later, here's what the same President Bush said again about the U.S. war in Afghanistan and about the Taliban.
In the United States of America, the terrorists have chosen a foe unlike they have never faced before. They've never faced a country like ours before. We're tough. We're determined. We're relentless. We will stay until the mission is done.
We will stay until the mission is done, by which he meant, again, vanquishing the Taliban. And then just 4 years later, we heard pretty much the same thing from the same president. Here is George Bush.
The days of the Taliban are over. The future of Afghanistan belongs to the people of Afghanistan, and the future of Afghanistan belongs to freedom.
So over and over and over, for the first several years of the war, we were led to believe the U.S. is winning. The Taliban was being vanquished, and that was because the U.S. was building a new government, a democratic government, one that would be protected by an Afghan military and an Afghan police force that the U.S. was funding and training. We have heard that message over and over and over again, all the way up until 5 weeks ago when President Joe Biden stood in the East Room of the White House during a press conference where he talked about his plans to draw down forces. And he was repeatedly pressed on whether the Taliban would take over the country very quickly, exactly what happened. And he repeatedly led everyone to believe, this is 5 weeks ago, that it was essentially impossible or highly unlikely because of, again, the vaunted Afghan National Security Forces. Listen to what the current president told us just 5 weeks ago about the situation.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true.
Can you please clarify what they have told you about whether that will happen or not?
That is not true. They did not reach that conclusion.
So what is the level of confidence that they have that it will not collapse?
The Afghan government and leadership has to come together. They clearly have the capacity to sustain the government in place. The question is, will they generate the kind of cohesion to do it? It's not a question of whether they have the capacity. They have the capacity. They have the forces. They have the equipment. The question is, will they do it? And I want to make clear what I made clear to Ghani, that we are not going to walk away and not sustain their ability to maintain that force. We are. We're going to also work to make sure we help them in terms of everything from food necessities and other things in the region.
So there were three individual claims there. The first is he vehemently denied that the intelligence report suggested that the Taliban would overrun the country once the U.S. withdrew. He said it is not the opinion of the intelligence community, and he was never told that. Secondly, he claimed that the Afghan National Security Forces, the thing that barely existed as it turns out, absolutely had the capacity to stand up and fight the Taliban. It was a question of whether they would do it, but they absolutely have the capacity, he said. And then thirdly, he promised the person who was until about 3 days ago, the president of Afghanistan, that no matter what, the U.S. would not abandon Afghanistan, that they would not allow its people or the people who were their partners to flee in danger, which of course is exactly what they've all done. So three things that he said just 5 weeks ago, all of which are blatantly false. Let's listen to other things that he told us on that same day.
Some Vietnamese veterans see echoes of their experience in this withdrawal in Afghanistan. Do you see any parallels between this withdrawal and what happened in Vietnam, with some people feeling...
None whatsoever. Zero. What you had entire brigades breaking through the gates of our embassy. 6, if I'm not mistaken. The Taliban is not the North Vietnamese army. They're not remotely comparable in terms of capability. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of a embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comparable.
Do you see how definitive he was there? There was no issuing caveats about likelihood. Absolutely not, he said angrily, will this be a situation like Saigon, where we see evacuations through helicopters and a desperation to get out of a country that has collapsed as a result of our withdrawal. Exactly what in fact ended up happening is something that the president just 5 weeks ago angrily and adamantly insisted was not even possible. Now, let's listen to something else he said on that same day.
The likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely.
Stephanie.
So here you have Joe Biden standing in the White House for an hour, issuing adamant statements, all of which turned out to be false about the situation, the security situation in Afghanistan. How could that possibly be the case when the U.S. has been in Afghanistan for 20 years, has the country completely under surveillance, has the most expensive intelligence apparatus in the entire world, has spent billions of dollars to build up this government and this military for the president? He's just extremely misinformed Just like George W. Bush 20 years ago was extremely misinformed when he kept saying that the Taliban had been vanquished. It's not just presidents, but military officials as well. Here's Major General Jeffrey Schlosser in 2008 speaking in Afghanistan about whether it was even a possibility that the U.S. would lose the war to the Taliban. Listen to what he said.
Are we losing this war? Absolutely no way. Can the enemy win it? Absolutely no way. The Afghans won't allow it, and the Afghan National Army is well beyond that already.
Do you see why everyone's so shocked with this kind of messaging? The Afghan army is so powerful. They would never allow the Taliban to win. Absolutely zero possibility, he said, that the Taliban would win the war and overrun Afghanistan and be back in power. Let's look now at other statements that we've heard. Here is the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, under Joe Biden. This is what he said in 2013 when he was still a lieutenant general with supervisory responsibility for Afghanistan. He, quote, said, "This army and this police force have been very, very effective in combat against the insurgents every single day." And I think that's an important story to be told across the board. This army and the police force have been very effective in combat against it barely existed, this army and this police force. 2001, 2008, 2013, 2021, hearing the same message over and over that is totally false about the U.S. progress toward victory in Afghanistan. That's why everyone's so shocked and horrified, because the reality of what we're seeing completely contravenes everything that we've been told. Now, the question becomes, how is it that we know that they're actually lying, as the headline of my article said, and as I've said here repeatedly? It's because there's indisputable evidence, mountains of it, that prove that to be true. But it's also true because this is what the U.S. government does continuously in order to justify the initiation of a war and then its continuation. And we can see other examples of this happening almost in identical ways. So in 1971, the former official at the RAND Corporation who worked with top secret information at the Pentagon, Daniel Ellsberg, leaked to the New York Times what ultimately ended up being called the Pentagon Papers. And what that showed, and the reason Ellsberg decided to leak it, was because throughout the 1960s under President Johnson, political and military officials were telling Americans who are growing very tired and frustrated with the Vietnam War, "Oh, don't worry, we're winning. Don't worry, we have the Viet Cong on the run. Don't worry, we're now fighting them and chasing them into South Vietnam," which proves that we're winning. And the documents that were revealed by Ellsberg and then published by the New York Times prove that in public they were saying that, just like they were saying publicly for 20 years that we were winning in Afghanistan. But in private, they were acknowledging that that was a lie, that we were losing, that we were having a great deal of difficulty fighting the Viet Cong. They were at best coming to a stalemate. That's what made those documents so important. And in 2021, on the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Pentagon Papers, the New York Times revisited that story and its importance and what it revealed. And one of the things it revealed was that it wasn't just the continuation of the Vietnam War accomplished by lies, but even its initiation, namely that the Johnson administration wanted to escalate in Vietnam. They needed congressional authorization to do it. In order to do that, they needed some kind of provocative cause because there were so many people in Washington against it. And then suddenly out of nowhere, they concocted what we now know is a false story about the North Vietnamese without provocation attacking American ships. And that made everyone so angry in Washington. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, as it was called, passed Congress easily. And then these Pentagon Papers proved that McNamara and other top Pentagon officials were knowingly lying about what actually happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. That is one thing that was revealed by those documents. Let's listen to what President Obama said in 2011 about the war that he wanted in Libya. And to remind all of you, the way that this happened was President Obama, with no congressional authorization, deployed American troops to Libya without any kind of approval from Congress, even though the Constitution requires that. And his argument at the time, which you're about to hear, was, oh, don't worry. We're not there to do regime change as those bad Bush Cheney officials did in Iraq. We're just there to help people, to protect them in a humanitarian mission in Benghazi and other places to make sure there's no slaughter or massacre of the Libyan people. We're good people. We want to just help. But I promise there's not going to be any regime change operation on the part of our military. This is what he said to the American people to justify this war.
Of course, there is no question that Libya and the world would be better off with Gaddafi out of power. I, along with many other world leaders, have embraced that goal and will actively pursue it through non-military means. But broadening our military mission to include regime change would be a mistake.
It would be a mistake. That's not what we're there for, he said. That's not the mission. 4 months later, the House of Representatives, the body vested with the Constitution by the Constitution to decide if the U.S. should go to war or not, voted against authorizing the use of military force in Libya, and Obama ignored it and continued based on this original lie, like the Vietnam War, one of the Gulf of Tonkin, that we weren't there for regime change. And yet just days after Obama stood before the country and said that, the New York Times reported, quote, even as President Obama on Monday described a narrow role for the United States in a NATO-led operation in Libya, the American military has been carrying out an expansive and increasingly potent air campaign to compel the Libyan army to turn against Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi. So Obama stood before the country and said that the military mission wasn't regime change, even as his own government was plotting to change the regime using military force. And as we all know, that ended up being the mission. The United States, with its NATO allies, bombed Libya until Gaddafi was gone. That was clearly the objective. They didn't stop until that happened. And now Libya is in utter chaos to this very day because Obama lied the country into the war in Libya, just like was done under the Johnson administration with the lies about the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, in 2019, as I said earlier, we have conclusive proof that U.S. political and military officials were lying when they were telling us that they believed they were coming closer and closer to victory in Afghanistan by building up the Afghan National Army. The Washington Post, and really was overlooked and not very discussed, published what they called the Afghanistan Papers, obviously a nod to the Pentagon Papers, and they subtitled it A Secret History of the War. They got their hands on secret documents, just like the New York Times did in 1971, showing that what military leaders were saying in private about the Afghan National Security Forces was the exact opposite of what they were telling Americans for years and years about the success of that army that they were building. And so the first Post article by Craig Whitlock on December 9th was headlined appropriately, At War with the Truth, meaning the U.S. government and military. And the subheadline was, U.S. officials constantly said they were making progress. They were not, and they knew it. An exclusive Post investigation found. Now, the Washington Post tends to be very deferential to and close to the intelligence community, the military-industrial complex, the war machine, and yet these documents were so conclusive, as were evidence they conducted in connection with them, that even they pulled no punches in saying that the government and military lied to the American people on purpose for many years about the progress they were making. Let's look at the specifics. It's really quite extraordinary. So the first part of the article reads this way. Year after year, U.S. generals have said in public they are making steady progress on the central plank of their strategy to train a robust Afghan army and national police force that can defend the country without foreign help. In Lessons Learned, which was a 2016 report they compiled in secret, in Lessons Learned interviews, however, U.S. military trainers described the Afghan security forces as incompetent, unmotivated, and rife with deserters. They also accused Afghan commanders of pocketing salaries paid by U.S. taxpayers for tens of thousands of, quote, ghost soldiers, soldiers that never existed yet for which they charged the U.S. government and ultimately you. None expressed confidence that the Afghan army and police could ever fend off, much less defeat the Taliban on their own. More than 60,000 members of Afghan security forces have been killed, a casualty rate that U.S. commanders have called unsustainable. Now, earlier today, President Biden, when he justified his decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, said, well, we're not going to risk the lives of our military for a country when not even the Afghan military will. They were dying at enormous rates. The problem was they were completely inept and incompetent and untrained and corrupt, as the military leaders were admitting in private, while publicly they were giving the exact opposite message. Now, the article goes on to say that, quote, several of those interviewed described explicit and sustained efforts by the U.S. government to deliberately mislead the public. They said it was common at military headquarters in Kabul and at the White House to distort statistics to make it appear the United States was winning the war when that was not the case. Look at how incriminating that is. They weren't just engaging in misleading propaganda, nor collecting recklessly the intelligence and therefore being misled themselves. They were fabricating documents and statistics to justify lying to the public, to lead us all to believe that they were winning and that this cost was worth it in lives and money. Now, the article goes on to state, the Post article from the Afghanistan papers, quote, every data point was altered to present the best possible picture, Bob Crowley, an Army colonel who served as a senior counterinsurgency advisor to U.S. military commanders in 2013 and 2014, told government interviewers, quote, surveys, for instance, were totally unreliable, but reinforced that everything we were doing was right, and we became a self-licking ice cream cone, end quote. John Sopko, the head of the federal agency that conducted the interviews, acknowledged to the Post that the documents show, quote, the American people have been constantly lied to. That is not me saying that military officials have been lying to the public about Afghanistan. These are the own military trainers and people who were tasked with reviewing the U.S. conduct in Afghanistan based on secret documents, saying that deliberately the American public was misled about what was happening there. In one of those reports, the Lessons Learned report from 2016, commissioned while President Obama was the commander-in-chief, the report asked, quote, what actions did the team take to achieve their objectives? The focus was on foreign internal defense. And then it says about a third of ALP, which is the Afghan security forces, seemed to be drug addicts or Taliban. They were a third of them were drug addicts or Taliban. The ALP's main concern was getting fuel from the U.S. unit. They always wanted fuel. So even back in 2016, the military internally was acknowledging that the Afghan National Security Forces, which we were being told was the key to winning the war, was a complete corrupt joke and fraud. In July of this year, last month, the independent journalist Michael Tracy published an article at his Substack, headline, quote, a big money funneling operation. Afghanistan vet reflects on withdrawal of U.S. forces. He interviewed a veteran who served in Afghanistan, and his main job was working on training the Afghan police. But in that course of that work, he also participated in numerous training sessions of the Afghan military. Michael Tracy, an independent journalist, was able to interview someone who told the truth about what was happening in Afghanistan 5 days after Joe Biden's press conference, where he said the Taliban are never going to take over the country. The Afghan National Security Forces are too strong. Here's what Michael Tracy, this independent journalist, was able to show the country based on interviewing a veteran in Afghanistan. Here's what the veteran said, quote, I would sit in on staff meetings because part of my position there was with the Joint Command that was building the Afghan military and police force. The division that I worked on was about training and was about training and policy for the Afghan police, and that also included arming and funding them. I don't think I could overstate that this was a system just basically designed for funneling money and wasting or losing equipment. It was just a money pit. They were just bilking the U.S. taxpayers, not just the Afghan warlords, but also U.S. military contractors, biding their time trying to get as rich as possible until the day that the U.S. left and knowing that the Taliban would take over. He went on, I would sit in meetings, in staff meetings, where we would talk about, okay, this month we sent 14 armored Humvees down to Helmand province for the border patrol, and 12 of those 14 Humvees along the way went missing or quote unquote broke down and were disabled. And this was a regular thing. Like the majority of shit we were adding to the inventory of these border patrol units just wasn't even making it there. They were equipping the Afghan National Security Forces, the military and the police, but they were just corrupt and they were stealing them. They weren't even getting to the people that they were intended for. He then went on to say, the overwhelming impression I got, it didn't occur to me that we were purposefully delivering this equipment into the hands of Al-Qaeda or whatever, but the sense that I got was, oh, well, the purpose of us being here is to justify pouring mountains of cash into the pockets of contractors, the manufacturers of this equipment. The incentive structure was lose shit because then it'll have to be replaced. We'll have to send more out there. Now, you tell me, how is it that there were veterans in Afghanistan involved in the training of the police and the military saying this, that the whole thing was a scam, that they weren't even trying to build an Afghan military force? It was about enriching U.S. military contractors and then whoever was getting kickbacks in Afghanistan. A month ago, when Joe Biden, the commander-in-chief, the person with the access to all the intelligence, was telling us that the Afghan National Security Force is way stronger than the Taliban, they don't compare in terms of their military force, that it's extremely unlikely we're going to see the Taliban taking over, that it's impossible that we're going to see a situation in Saigon. Obviously, there were people who knew the truth and were publishing the truth and saying the truth. Do you remotely believe that Joe Biden didn't know this when he stood up and justified his decision, which, by the way, I believe was correct, just as I believe it was correct when Donald Trump wanted to withdraw all troops from Afghanistan? You don't think he knew this? If Michael Tracy and this veteran did at the Washington Post, which was publishing in 2019, all of this, knew about it? Here's a tweet from the person who was the president of Afghanistan until about 3 days ago, Ashraf Ghani, in which he conveys what President Biden told him, quote, "This evening, I spoke with President Biden over a phone call." This is from July 23rd, so just about 3 weeks ago. "We discussed the evolving but continuing relationship between the two countries. President Biden reassured me that support for the Afghan National Defense Force will continue. We have confidence that they will protect and defend Afghanistan." So even what Biden was saying to the Afghan president was something he knew he couldn't do. Now, as I said, these lies have been going on for the longest time. Here's President Obama in 2014 promising that he would fulfill his campaign pledge in 2008 to get out of Afghanistan, and in 2012 to get out of Afghanistan. And then the Afghanistan papers revealed that while Obama was telling all of you that he wanted to leave Afghanistan, secretly, the military was ensuring that it was a fake promise, that he was working with Obama to create so many exceptions. In the skies, U.S. fighters, bombers, helicopters, and drones would continue to fly on the ground. The Pentagon created another combat exception for troops carrying out counterterrorism operations. So even Obama's own announcement that he was in the process of ending the war in Afghanistan was a complete sham and fraud. That, too, was a lie. Here is President Obama quoting and tweeting Joe Biden's statement, promise to the American people when running for re-election in 2012 in his vice presidential debate with the GOP vice presidential nominee Paul Ryan, quote, "Vice President Biden in Afghanistan, we are leaving in 2014, period." That's what Biden said is promoted by Obama. And then the whole time they knew when they were promoting that promise that it was being gutted by the military to ensure we stayed forever. Now, one last reason why I know for certain that this was not just some good faith mistake, but a lie, is that I worked extensively on an archive given to me by my source, Edward Snowden, in 2013 and 2014, much of which described the extraordinary and comprehensive surveillance that the United States military and the NSA had put Afghanistan under. They knew everything and know everything that's happening in Afghanistan. And although we didn't report most of it because our source, Edward Snowden, asked that we not report on active war zones if it could endanger people and not really reveal much to the public, that the only exception would be if they were engaged in illegality or deceit, and we honored that commitment. We did do reporting that showed just how extensive the NSA had Afghanistan under a microscope. One article from 2014 that I reported with Laura Poitras, the journalist who won the Pulitzer Prize with me on this story, is, quote, the NSA is recording every cell phone call in the Bahamas. And it went on to say that the National Security Agency is secretly intercepting, recording, and archiving the audio of virtually every cell phone call, of every cell phone conversation on the island nation of the Bahamas. And it then went on to describe that this was a plan, a program that had been installed in 4 other nations, one of which, although we didn't report it at the time, it was subsequently revealed, was Afghanistan. That's how comprehensive was the reporting and the surveillance and monitoring that the NSA and the US government had put Afghanistan under. They could literally have the ability to store every cell phone call, and were doing that so that they could go back and review it and listen to any call that was made by a cell phone anytime. And that was a small portion of the surveillance under which they had placed Afghanistan. So it is inconceivable that the military and the government would have gotten this so wrong, that they were just in good faith mistaken about what was happening at the Taliban and the Afghan National Security Forces. Now, as I said, I reported on this morning. I compiled all the evidence for it. I wanted to make sure you could actually see the video and the graphics, because I think they're incredibly important about the mountain of proof we have, but also about the history of similar lying by governments for decades. First, to lie our countries into a war that has no benefit to the people, that makes people rich in Washington and powerful in Washington, but does nothing for the American people except risk their lives and their hard-earned taxpayer money, but also to justify its continuation by constantly claiming they're winning when in private they know they're not. That happened in Vietnam, and it most definitely happened in Afghanistan. And I think it's extremely important that we remember this, not just retrospectively. That's what usually happens, is we find out the evidence that our government is lying once the war is over, but the next time the government tries to sell us a war, we remember how constantly and frequently and systematically and reflexively they lied to us. And you can read that article as well as all of my other written journalism by subscribing to greenwald.substack.com. And you can continue to watch the video journalism that I am doing with my base here at Rumble, another free speech platform like Substack, by continuing to subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate your listening to what I think is an extremely important set of events and evidence about the war in Afghanistan, which seems, from the perspective of the US, to finally have ended.